All right.
The webinar is live.
All right. It's 10 a.m. We'll get rolling. Thank you, everybody, for joining today, and welcome to today's webinar on cybersecurity. Happy to have you all on this Wednesday. We will be having an interactive panel discussion today around the threats businesses face, the actions to take, and how to keep the money out of the hackers' hands. If you're not familiar with Kelly Connect, welcome. We help companies create strategic advantages through the use of technology and business solutions, including IT and security, which we'll discuss today, digital transformation, and office equipment. And we have 29 offices serving the Pacific Northwest states of Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Montana, and Alaska. And with that, it's a panel discussion. I want to turn it over to our moderator. She's one of the most passionate people I know in regard to protecting businesses in the current threat landscape and is a very strategic partner to Kelly Connect. Christina, thank you for moderating, and take us away.
Great, thanks, Scott. Welcome, everybody. Glad everybody is here. I'm going to go ahead and kick off with some housekeeping items. We would love to hear from you. So we have a great panel of experts here, but we're also going to end in Q&A starting at 10:40 Pacific Standard Time. There is a Q&A button at the bottom, so please submit your questions as they come in. And we also, at the end of this, will be sending out the recording and links to the recommended resources, as well as the deck from today's conversation. If you do want to spit, again, your questions during the conversation, feel free, and I can chime in while the panel is chatting. Now, to introduce our guest speakers here today, we have a fantastic group of people on the panel that I'd like to introduce. First, David Kane. He's the founder and CEO of Ethical Intruder, a cybersecurity and compliance service company. David has developed a methodology called Cyber Liability Maturity Model, CLMM, which is used to build roadmaps around key industry security and compliance requirements. The CLMM was initially developed to address client and insurance company requirements to assist with corporate purchase of our insurance underwriting of cyber liability insurance. We have Jonathan Gorella. John, he's our security analyst at ConnectWise. So John and I are colleagues. He is one of our top cyber investigators. He is responsible for conducting information security investigations as a result of security incidents and providing partners with incident response during critical times. Scott Anderson is the SVP of Kelly Connect. He's been in the IT space for 15 years, previously founded Core Business Services before merging with Kelly Connect. And he's passionate about reducing risk across client environments. We definitely have that in common. And then Steven Overko, he's a solution engineer at SentinelOne with over a decade of experience, specifically in endpoint security. He's currently focused solely on helping MSPs mature their security practices and enabling them to keep their customer base not only protected against today's threats, but ahead of the unknown. And just to quickly introduce myself again, Christina Ballmer. I've advised hundreds of companies on rolling out new security strategies, and I'm on a mission to help save businesses from cyber attacks. Before we jump into the panel discussion and let the experts share all of their wonderful knowledge, I just wanted to share a recent article that was published on Data Breach Today. It's comparing the first and second quarters of this year. Average ransom paid by a victim has increased by 60%. So the new average this year is almost 200K that small and medium-sized businesses face. When it comes to ransomware attacks, we're seeing an incredible increase to the cost that SMBs are having to pay. What is happening is even though the payment has been made, the hackers are still taking your data, they're holding that ransom, and then they're threatening you to release that onto the dark web without an additional larger payment. So you get hit with ransom, you're making an initial payment to have your data decrypted, and then another often larger payment to get your data back and prevent it from being released to the dark web. So the topics to be covered today in the content, we're really at a tipping point in the evolution of cyber defense, and we need to come together to fight back. Today or this month, October is Cybersecurity Awareness Month. So again, thank you for joining us and understanding the importance of continuously educating yourself on security. We need to keep our money working for our own businesses. So think of all the cyber crimes that have became a way of life, and most organizations are just too slow to address the risk, believing it's not broken, or if if it's not broken, don't fix it. They don't have enough budget allocated for it, or they just don't know enough on the areas they need to reduce their risk. So that's why I'm so excited to have our experts here today. And we'll go ahead and kick it over to the panel here. So Jonathan, being in the SOC and fighting against the hackers every single day, what are some top threats that businesses are facing today?
Yeah, Christina. Obviously being kind of on that ground level and really getting to see it face to face on a daily basis. The most that we're seeing, obviously I could talk about ransomware for days. I think everybody hears that word all over the place. Ransomware is a big one. The top threats though, I mean, that's more of a result and not really the main scope of the attack there. We're seeing a lot of phishing, a lot of social engineering. A lot of those are kind of what lead into those further compromises and further incidents. But definitely, I mean, that's where we're at today a lot. It's definitely the most prominent item that we see, and I think it's going to stay that way into the future as well for quite a while.
Yeah, and I guess I'll jump in if that's okay.
Yeah, go ahead, Steve.
So you kind of took one of my speaking points, which was as you said, it's really a result. They don't just magically like appear on your computer, right? Typically, it takes either social engineering, phishing email, etc. So I would say the top threats to businesses are typically going to be the end users, especially now that they're working from home. People, I will say I've gone to plenty of my friends' houses while they were working, while they were finishing up meetings, and I can guarantee you they're not just using their computer for work. People are, they're browsing the internet. They're like, ooh, Big Brother's not watching me because I'm not in an office anymore. So they get a lot more relaxed in terms of security. So they start checking their personal email, browsing social networks, and just going places they shouldn't. And yeah, that increases things. But also, once they start opening up, whether it's phishing emails in their work email or their personal email, pretty much every attack I've seen, a majority of them, they all start with a phishing link or attachment. So, but yeah, kind of just echoing your point, John.
Yeah, you definitely have a great point there about the remote workforce, and people can be pretty relaxed at work sometimes as well, but when they're in an office. But at the same time, now that everybody's in most cases at home, it feels like things have dropped another level, and people definitely aren't being as security conscious as we would like in most cases. Sometimes even as far as working from their home PC instead of their company sanctioned device, or going through their VPN or whatever case that they might need to do. So there's definitely that level of relaxation there that's making it easier, if anything, than it used to be.
So yeah, if I could jump in, I think taking a couple of those pieces, the phishing is huge. The users are the issue because they're the ones that are clicking on the phishing emails. So what a lot of that comes down to is really behaviors. So as businesses, they need to focus a little bit on what are the behaviors that are causing this, and it really comes from two different angles. One is the behaviors of how people act when they're not at work, and I think what happened is people used to focus a lot on their network boundaries and sort of understand what happens within their office, and have compliance and security controls around what people will do in their office. And now they haven't really extended those same boundaries to the home and taken that same responsibility. Definitely something to focus on. And then the other piece is that the reason why this is happening again is behavioral. If you look at COVID, and obviously that's why we're home, the attackers know that our defenses are down, right? So behaviors are like, having a kid not run into the street or not touching a hot stove. And so the idea is that it's so easy as a hacker or as an ethical hacker to use that because you're playing on a behavior. And so reinforcing and training those behaviors and getting people to be aware of those behaviors is what's going to stop those issues from happening. And then the businesses sort of focusing again on their network boundaries and what behaviors they want their employees to have at work. That covers that full spectrum of users versus hackers versus sort of why this is happening.
Yeah, and to your point, actually, I'm happy you said the word behavior so many times, by the way. But if you think about it, I mean, it's really trying to fight thousands of years of human evolution around fear. So recently, we actually had a few researchers that focus more on the fear aspect in phishing. And a lot of the social engineering techniques and a lot of the phishing emails, if you look at them, they use that behavioral training a little bit to try to get people to, they push urgency and they really try to manipulate people, right? So like, for instance, Black Energy is a good example. All they had to do was pose as the Ukrainian federal government to create the sense of urgency to get people to open the Excel document that eventually took down the power grid, right? So, so they're really good at targeting weaknesses in human behavior specifically. But yeah, I was happy you said behavior. So you're feeding right into me.
Yeah, one thing to add on to that, and the reason why I do mention it a lot is I think it's important for those in the audience of businesses, is that a lot of people look at this as an IT problem, something to handle technically, or they look at it as an HR problem to do training. And the bottom line is it's a behavioral problem that you handle through HR and IT, but you have to realize that that's sort of what's behind it. And then it's easier to address the IT part and the HR training part.
And when I think about behavioral, I think two different things. One, behavior from our employees, and that results in a training, top down. We need to create this security culture, and our employees need to understand the importance of the data and what would happen if they did leak particular data, and be held accountable for those things, in my opinion. And then we also have what we look at when we think about being proactive and implementing certain layers of security, like a artificial or old AV versus a EDR solution in today's world. But how do you, I mean, in your opinion, David, how do you hold employees at home accountable?
So it does start with the business. So at Ethical Intruder, we don't really promote specific technologies or partners to work with, but they're all good. So everybody on this call are, they're all good to work with. But the point is that it has to start with management first, understanding that it's a behavioral issue, and then looking at the different aspects of how they can control this. Again, you have to look at what used to be your work from home policies and your remote policies. Look at what used to be your corporate boundaries and decide what you're going to accept as your risk, and realize what is your risk. And then going back to the layers that you mentioned, we talked about this a little bit before the call, is to realize that with social engineering and phishing, which I think everybody has pretty much agreed is the number one vector, like we do this with networks, you have to use sort of depth. So we use defense in depth for our networks and our endpoints, and people are usually very skinny on how they do this. So there's a lot of great products out there that help with behavior and can detect. There's social engineering training that you get through products or services like we provide. There's just information that you can send out to hold people, accountable. You can go back to policies, but really it goes back to the business trying to understand, use those words again, what the behaviors are, and then figuring out between IT and HR and products, policies, and what risk they will accept. And just to finish on the risk to accept, I think lots of times we talk about what's a risk versus what's a risk we accept. And very often if you go to a board and you say, we do not accept certain behaviors, inside of our corporation. I just want to be clear to the board, we are accepting those risks at home, correct? And people will probably say no. And as soon as they say no, now you can address it. So the sooner you say, are we accepting this risk, the easier you can actually address what that risk is.
Yep. And I try to teach any of my clients that I speak with, or even my friends, what you do at work, you should be doing at home, right? Scott, how about you? I know that you guys are heavily involved in risk management and incident response, and helping your clients with that. So what do you have to add there?
Yeah, I mean, I think, making sure that your security program starts with really having a risk discussion. Too many times, the tools are jumped into. Here are the tools and the security suites that we need to implement, and we've got a bunch of point solutions. But to really implement a program, we need to understand the risk. And like David said, not all risk is equal, right? So how do we determine what our risks are? And we like to think of that as risk profiles, right? Maybe a high probability of a certain risk, but it has a low impact. So maybe we're not going to invest our budget there like we would to a high probability of a risk and a high impact, right? So it's really classifying those different risks, which in my mind starts with some sort of gap analysis or risk assessment to really get all those risks on the table and then classify them into the profiles. And then we all know it comes down to budget at some point. And again, piggybacking David said also, it's okay to accept some risk. What we see too many times is people accept risk that they don't know about. And they don't know about it because, unfortunately, a lot of IT people are afraid of calling out risks because they're also afraid of saying it takes dollars to remediate those risks. IT for the longest time, there's been too much value people place in IT to be a cost reduction rather than let's get all the gaps, let's get all the risks on the table, let's profile those, let's prioritize them, and then have business discussions around them to determine which ones we start working through and how do we start removing some of those risks. And knowing that accepting some of those risks is an acceptable strategy. So I think it comes down to really profiling your risks and understanding what they are.
Yeah. So it sounds like, not only are our top threats to businesses are the hackers and what they can do, but our top threats are not educating our employees. They're not having a business risk conversation with your IT provider. You're not being proactive and taking proactive actions, which leads me into our next question. Steve, so you work for Sentinel One, a great organization that has a layer of security, in my opinion, that really is that baseball bat to ransomware. So talk to me a little bit about what proactive actions, in your opinion, businesses need to take to protect themselves.
Yeah. So number one, we're going to be quoting Dave quite a lot today, I have a feeling, but but Dave mentioned something which is pretty important about the perimeter is really changing. I think everyone can probably guess what I'm going to say next, but the perimeter is the endpoint these days. It's the laptop that's sitting at home. It's the laptop that's now in the coffee shop or on that plane, etc. So that's changed things quite a bit because when when the typical, let's say, end user goes home with their laptop, how secure is their home network? I don't think a lot of people, like, I don't know, John, Dave, and we probably have several VLANs which separate all of our devices at home. Not everyone's going to do that. Most people just go to Best Buy, grab a Netgear router or something, set it up with all default passwords, and boom, that's their home network that they're now working from. So there's a lot of things to look at. I mean, number one, most people have Amazon Alexas, IoT devices, everything like that. Those are all different avenues, really, for how attackers might be able to take a look at traffic as it's crossing the wire back to a corporate environment. So it's important to implement basic things like VPN connections. Now, VPNs aren't perfect. I do want to say that as well. I don't know if everyone's familiar with like the what's the phrase, the castle and the moat approach. If you make it across the moat into the castle, technically you're allowed to see all the resources inside the castle now. So that's why a lot of partners that I've been seeing on the endpoint side have been focusing more on like a zero trust type mentality. And that's getting extremely popular because, yeah, when you connect with, let's say you're using Zscaler or something like that, you're not getting access to everything in the castle. You can only go to, you know, the barn or the house that you're allowed to see, right? So I think number one, securing the communications, very important. Securing the endpoint, I'm an endpoint vendor, so I'm going to be pretty biased here, but securing the endpoint equally as important, because you can train employees quite a lot. We're all human beings. Yeah, I've clicked a phishing link a time or two. I'm not perfect either. So sometimes people just get caught up in the moment as they're reading through an email. They click the link or open the attachment by accident, and it just happens. So that's why having something a little bit more advanced on the endpoint, rather than, you know, just something that's checking off a box for compliance, just, hey, we have signature-based detection to catch low-hanging fruit, let's call it a day. Having something which can do a bit more, like pick up that macro payload, hopefully prevent it, or can use the behavioral word again, track the behavior on the endpoint, so that way, heaven forbid something does happen, it can dynamically track it and adjust in real time. So
Yeah.
not by any
And-
means a complete list, but a few
Yeah,
basics.
for sure. And nothing is 100% immune when we're talking about, you know, implementing certain tool sets or your employees. You can still train your employees and educate your employees, but at the end of the day, we're humans and we make mistakes. So in my mind, that's, you know, definitely why I love the fact that a lot of our partners have the ability to work with a security operations center where John is involved in. John, any stories that you could share with us on the aftermath once the our employees click on bad links, what happens and how people can be more proactive?
I mean, stories for days, definitely. Yeah, there's tons of those. Just to kind of touch on the proactive point that we were discussing there first. You know, everything Steve said was fantastic, and that's right on par with what I would kind of be saying too. But in general, just on that proactive measure too, about like why we should be working proactively and putting that commitment forward. I think there's a, you know, this notion might be disappearing, but I still think there's this notion today where it's easy to ignore issues. It's easy to not train people. It's easier to not spend the money or the time commitment. And sometimes you don't have the resources to do that. And I also think that a lot of time when it's a perception based thing. So when we talk about, you know, quote unquote, cyber criminals or hackers or whatever the case may be, it's kind of part of the conversation of how we discuss them. And it's almost like we view them in a certain light where we think, okay, well, it's just this guy in this basement, or it's just these guys over in this random country that are working in a little office or something. And I think sometimes, especially when we have these conversations with people, we don't, they don't really realize the depth of the fact that this stuff is a business. You know, it's not, it's almost a trap to think that way. It's not just a guy over here usually, or it's not just two guys over there. It's a business. They have everything laid out, you know, financially, tools wise, everything that they're using, especially when it comes to some of these major attacks that you hear about on the news, you know, and they're, you know, major attacks to kind of your point earlier. Just because you don't hear about them on the news doesn't mean that they're not happening all the time. I deal with things almost on a weekly basis that we're talking millions of dollars of loss, and you don't hear about that anywhere. So I think it's definitely part of the proactive discussion and why you should work with your cybersecurity professionals, your internal IT teams, and whatnot, is realizing that what you're up against is a rival business, except that rival business isn't just about taking your clients or your customers and slowly putting you out of business. They're about shutting you down tomorrow and instantaneously. And so it's kind of changing that mentality on how you're thinking about these threat actors and approaching them from a different angle there. But yeah, to your point about you know, incidents and stories, keeping things less details the better, but there's definitely been quite a few situations you know, we've easily seen phishing link go to credential compromise, go to somebody being able to take over, like, let's say, an RMM tool, and then use that to deploy something like ransomware across a multiple client environment. The loss and the time down, I mean, we were talking months worth of restoration and fixing things, and hundreds of people involved, whether remote or on site, you know, restoring machines, rebuilding pretty much an entire network. And that, I mean, even something like that, I would say, is pretty high to medium size of things that we've seen. Now, that gets kind of crazy. That's on the higher end of the scale. But even on just a lower end of the scale, you know, I frequently work with clients and partner base, or even if it's not a major deal like that, you know, you have a lot of businesses that are a couple servers, maybe 30, 40, 100 workstations. If you take down one of those servers, it could just be the Exchange server. If they just get hooks in there, we're not talking about everything being down. You're bringing that business down for at least a day, potentially a week, depending on how good backups and what other processes they had put in place, and if they even have the resources to deal with it. A lot of places, you know, you're kind of strapped and they're not ready for these cataclysmic type events to occur, because a lot of people don't work proactively to try to prevent these things, or try to get, you know, do risk assessments and try to put plans in place. So I think that all wraps around somehow.
Yeah, and there was a stat that I saw a while back, but I think it was 40 hour. It takes about 40 hours per terabyte of data to get
Yeah.
back up. So depending upon, you know, how much data you have there, and a lot of people, you know, Scott, and maybe you can chime in here, but a lot of people think that just because I have my information backed up that I'm safe. But I've been hearing more and more stories about the hackers getting to the backups. So, you know, what types of conversations should you be having with your IT providers or IT in-house?
Yeah, and I think that ties into, you know, everybody talks about backup, right? What are you doing for backup? Are you backed up? And we try to talk all the time. Who cares, right? Really, we just care about, can we recover? So it's the conversation should never be about backup, but it should be about when you need to recover. Is it going to work? How are you going to do it? How long is it going to take you to recover? And so when we think about, you know, the bad guys now maybe getting into a network and sitting there for quite a while before they expose themselves. And in the meantime, you know, maybe they're deleting backups. So when they do, you know, push out the ransomware, it's a better chance of payment. So it's really, you know, how can you recover if your main backups are a target as well? So what are you doing to make sure that those backups are in multiple places, cold storage? How are you going about that? But really the conversation should be about recovery rather than backup.
Yeah, and part of your recovery should be your cybersecurity insurance policy. But the more businesses I talk to, the more say, I don't need to put the proper layers in place. I don't need to train my employees because I have a cybersecurity policy that's $1 million, so I'm covered. So David, I'm going to kick it over to you to talk a little bit about this and help educate, you know, the audience on what to look for and the questions to ask.
Sure. So the first thing not to do is to assume that you're okay because you have a cyber liability insurance policy. That's probably one of the worst things that you can do. It is good to have a policy. The problem is almost every company that we work with, and we do cyber liability insurance reviews with everybody that we work with, I would say I don't know that I've ever found a company that actually knows what's inside of their policy. So what I mean by that is that typical policy covers external breaches, internal breaches, and errors and omission. And the problem is that they all handle them differently. They all have a different rule set on how you can actually do the claim come back. They all have different rules about who to contact, when to contact, the order of whether you call the insurance, you call the authorities, you call your attorney, when do you tell your employees, when do you tell your clients. If anything is out of order, you don't get to keep up with your claim. Plus, when you have a cyber liability insurance policy, usually somebody filled out something that says what your security posture is. Usually they didn't work with IT, which means that if that doesn't match up, it would be a problem. So when you're looking at buying a policy, make sure that you work with IT. Make sure that if anybody's out there that works in IT anywhere, please ask for the cyber liability insurance policy of the company that you work with. Anybody that works in incident response, 100% you have to know what's in the policy, because again, it'll tell you how many hours you have, who to contact, what the issues are. So the bottom line is, don't just buy a policy. Work with somebody or try to read through it to understand what's in the policy. We always tell customers, we don't care what's in your policy. We just don't want you to be surprised when all of a sudden it doesn't cover ransomware. It doesn't cover CEO fraud. It doesn't cover somebody in finance getting a phish and sending a check for $100,000. It doesn't cover somebody internally turning the intranet intranet into the internet, which we've seen. There's a lot of strange things that are not covered. So really, rule number one is, if you're going to have a policy, have some idea what you're buying. So you can go to our website for our cyber liability maturity model. Again, we don't sell a product, but you can sort of just look at some of the things that you might want to review in order to understand what's in your policy. It's just a matter of understanding all the steps and all the different pieces. But we have seen so many companies get burnt because they believe they have a policy. And the other thing that they get burnt with a lot, I know this is going to sound strange, do not call your insurance provider as soon as you think that you have an incident. They will immediately contact forensic people's attorneys, other people, that you cannot put the genie back in the bottle. 9 times out of 10, when we get called by a company that they have an incident, they've already called their insurer. We find out they actually weren't breached, and now they're still having audits, right? If you're in the DoD space, the health space, the financial space, you cannot stop that from happening. So everybody here on the call is, primarily with a third party. Contact your third parties, help them to understand, make sure you know the rules of when to contact everybody. But there's just so much related to that policy that 99% of the time people just don't focus on. And at the end of the day, that policy protects your financial strength for your company, and it protects your reputation. And if you don't focus on those two aspects, all the other great things that all of us on the call are doing isn't going to matter as much. You have to understand what you signed up for. So that's just a little bit about the policies, but they're super important. Just make sure you know what's in there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the biggest thing that I learned the other day was, a client said, I have $1 million cybersecurity insurance policy. And what they didn't understand was the fact that it didn't cover downtime. So they were down, into John's point earlier, he's down for months. That's not covered.
Yep. So just like many other pieces that I said, that is an additional rider that you have to have. Errors and omissions related to cybersecurity is an additional rider that you need to have. And so again, it doesn't matter as much what you have. You just need to know what you do have. Another thing that people don't know a lot is they may call us and we'll say, check your policy. And the policy says there are 2 named vendors that are $800 an hour that are the only people they're allowed to work with. You need to know who you're allowed to work with, who you're not allowed to work with. Again, know your call tree, all of those things. Otherwise, that policy is really sort of a false, comfort. But you're right. Yeah, we see a lot of issues just over people not knowing what the policy is.
Yeah,
that's what we see a lot too, is that false comfort. I think, David, is that, we ask our clients all the time, do you have cyber insurance? And 9 out of 10 say yes, but most of the time it's a small additional piece on their standard liability policy, which really does nothing, right, compared to a separate cyber liability policy. So it's really understanding the details, so when there is that incident, you know what's covered.
And to kind of echo that point, both of you guys. Yeah, that's exactly from my end. That's one of the first conversations that I'll typically have with someone if it comes to that point. And most people do not know what's actually in the policy when you ask them about it. And it goes, okay, well, there's a lot of things that are potentially defined there that we need to know right now. And when you're having an incident is probably not the best time to have to find out what your cyber insurance policy contains. So
an easy way too is that for companies that have any type of compliance, we were talking about FedRAMP earlier, but FedRAMP, HIPAA, NIST 800-171, they all have a requirement for tabletop exercises for incident response. So the perfect thing to do is to introduce your cyber liability policy into your incident response tabletop exercise. So in that exercise, when you review what you would do in the case of an emergency, again, you should know how to escalate, who to escalate to, who to call, what the timelines are. And then another piece that's really important to that, going back to a couple of previous conversations about risk management, and John brought up about business, is that within risk management and within business continuity, there's the concept of the business impact analysis. And there's a bunch of like complicated or what seems like complicated terms like RTO and MTD and all of these things that seem scary. But the bottom line is, at the end of the day, if you work with the business and you understand which assets, servers, pieces of data are the ones that are of most value, if you then work backwards on all of that business impact analysis and then tie that back into what does your policy cover, and then think about that when you're doing an incident response tabletop, all of those things should intersect. And actually, everything in cybersecurity should intersect. So again, with our cyber liability maturity model, the idea is, incident response plans do tie into your contracts with your vendors, and they tie into the training with your users, and they tie into the policies that you have. And so people treat everything as silos. Like I have a guy at a SOC, and I also have an incident response policy. Those have got to intersect. And I think people look at training, employees, assessments, all these things as silos. And the more you can sort of look at the big picture and how everything connects, the better all of this gets.
Yeah. And I think this can be, if you're just starting off your security venture and trying to roadmap everything out with your, IT provider, with Kelly Connect, it can get overwhelming, especially listening to all of this that you have to do. You're like, wow, there's like a laundry list of things. So, I mean, David, you chimed in a little bit on how to prioritize that, but does anyone else have any advice for the audience on, where to start if you're at base zero?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. So our customers range from companies that really have like one employee and a couple part-timers to, Fortune 50 companies. And everybody's sort of in the same boat. Where are we today? How do we start? Where do we begin? And I think the best thing to do is, again, work with the vendors, work with the types of people that are on this call, but realize that all those pieces that I mentioned are in there: training, policy, compliance. The place I would probably start is business obligations, right? What do my customers, my insurers, and my compliance require of me that will help me to maintain or grow my business? So for instance, if you get questionnaires, and one of the biggest things that's on there is have multi-factor authentication, I can tell you right now, the best way to not get a new contract or work with a partner or meet a compliance is not having like multi-factor authentication. So you can start with some small pieces and you can grow from there, but don't buy into it's one product or one piece. You have to understand the whole ecosystem, start to prioritize. Look at all of the different pieces, reach out to a third party if you have to. I'm sure everybody out here on the call can help out with this. But we start with people who are super small all the time. You can start with the basics. And the three things that we always recommend that probably eliminate almost every single issue that we've talked about on this call is when we get a call about ransomware or a phish attack, the first thing we do is we want to understand about their passwords. What is the complexity? How often do they reset them? Do they use VPNs, and do they have multi-factor authentication? And I can tell you that almost every single time there's an issue, one of those three is a problem, right? It's not a huge deal to have a VPN, even if you start simple. It's not a big deal to have multi-factor authentication. If you have Office 365, you can pay an extra couple bucks a month and turn it on. It's not a big deal to have a complex password. So start with the basic things. And then the one that follows right after that I don't remember, I think it was Scott who mentioned this, is make sure you can recover. If you can stop people from coming in with those three things help you to do, and you can recover, you're going to win this battle 99% of the time. Unfortunately, we're all still needed because there is a lot of stuff in between. But if you're small and you're starting from scratch, those are some of the key things that will just get you a huge way into the beginning of your program.
And I think those three are great points also because they're low cost, like you said.
Yes.
Those aren't huge uplifts and huge budget expenditures. So when we can check the boxes and it really doesn't even use a lot of budget, that's a win all the way around.
And then after the secure with those three things, then you can talk to all of us about all our services. But we all want to make sure you're secure first. But yeah, I mean, it's, start with the things that are obvious and are free and that are accessible to you. I mean, if you have Office 365 and a lot of people have moved towards that, there's a security and compliance center built in. There's just a zillion things that you can do without adding extra products, but you just have to learn what's there. Focus on what you can control with what you have. Do patch management, check for vulnerabilities, start with the basic stuff. And then when you have the basics down, start talking to companies like us, if you're smaller, to start figuring out how to add those layers of depth that we've been talking about.
And those are the things that you can add into your HR policies, right? And those are the things that you can hold your employees accountable. It's the password complexity. It's making sure 2FA is, installed on all of your business applications. Simple things like that. And I joke, but I'm very serious about it. When we run dark web scans, and Scott, I know you and your team run these all the time for your clients, or alert them when their credentials show back up on the dark web. But it's one of the cheapest way to mitigate risk, right?
Right.
My credentials are on the dark web. Go change them.
Yeah, and we've got a dark web story of how a pretty large size business got compromised because their chief operating officer's LinkedIn password was on the dark web. So they had email and password, and it was, the password was something like Go Ducks with an exclamation point in it. And the penetration test people kind of looked online and saw that the executive team looked like some younger athletic guys. And so they took all the Oregon and Washington sports teams and put them into a password generating tool. And long story short, the administrator password for the network was something around Go Blazers with a bunch of extra things in it. And long story short, they were able to get into the network, do a bunch of bad stuff, could have done a bunch of bad stuff, all because of something from the dark web off of LinkedIn. So really it is powerful when you think, man, the network was cracked just because LinkedIn was also cracked.
Yeah, passwords. So one of the things that we find too, going back to the beginning, and as Steve will say is one of my favorite word, behaviors, a lot of executives are like, oh, let's not ask people to change their passwords. People are going to feel bad, or, again, the reason why we're doing it is not for a security reason. It's again, so that we can protect our reputation and keep our business. And you never want to go to a customer and say, you know what, your data was exposed, because we wouldn't want to go to, Tony, Tim, and Sally, and we felt bad asking them to change their password. And then one other thing about that too, and everybody has a different way of how this works, but the new NIST standards are actually super easy. It sounds horrible at first. Use between 14 to 16 characters, but there's no special characters, uppercase, lowercase, numbers, or anything else. You can take common words, then you can string them together again, as long as they're in a non-common way. Look at your desk right now, pencil, cup, wallet, right? That's your password, right? It's almost impossible based off of length to break. You don't have to have all this crazy uppercase, lowercase, all of these pieces. And you can remember it. Hopefully you can remember it. So yeah, that and some of the other pieces that we talked about, don't be a victim because you're not doing the simple things. Don't do it because of behaviors. Do it because you have a business to protect. You know, John brought up about business earlier, and this is a business for hackers, and they really are trying to go after your data, your intellectual property, right? Your financial records, your medical records. It's not a matter of a guy just trying to plant malware. So that's what you're trying to protect. Just change your password.
And to Dave's point there on that end part there, especially, you know, we keep saying ransomware and everything else. You know, that's damaging and that's bad, and that can put a company down. But a lot of the times, it's the data exfiltration that happens during and before and after that. That is actually the real damage that's about to come that nobody pays attention to. So there's a lot of, you know, everybody sees that front end and goes, oh, you know, our systems are encrypted, everything's down, you know, we can't work, and that's all. That could be enough to cripple. But then, you know, the aftermath of that, of data exfiltration and people taking, whether it's, you know, whatever private company data or anything you guys might be working on, you know, that's the really important piece that you're trying to protect with all of this. I mean, that's what you see nowadays everywhere. Breach here, breach there. It doesn't matter. Google a company and they probably had a breach of customer data. It feels like it happens almost weekly. So
Well, there's different websites out there that you can actually go on and see the companies that have had breaches, and that'll be shared in the recommended resources page. So me as a consumer, it's always important. I go on, like the one time I walked into my doctor's office and I saw like cables hanging out and they had like all this paperwork all over, and I'm like, when I put my social security number in, where does it go to, and who's your IT provider, and where is it being backed up to? But you have to be that way. And think about even like school districts, how much information they have of our children, and hackers taking advantage of that. You know, I don't want them to get a hold of my son or daughter's social security number and birth date, and then they become them, and all of a sudden we find out that they're, you know, having to file bankruptcy under their name when they're 4 years old or something. So it's a scary world. So guys, we're running up on time here, and I just would love to hear from all of you. Scott, if you want to go ahead and kick it off here, but is there any last recommendations or your top recommendations for businesses to focus on in today's world and landscape?
I think one of the biggest things, and we touched upon it a couple times, is what are you doing to create or promote a security culture? So every day, this is something that, you know, from the CEO down to everybody in a cube, everybody has a role in that. And what are you doing to promote that? And it was mentioned early, you know, that phishing is still the #1 vector. And now that everybody's working from home, I think it's tougher to promote that security culture when we're not in cubes next to each other. You know, when everybody's in the office together, if I get a phishing email that looks suspicious, I might lean over the cube next to me and ask the person next to me, hey, what do you think of this? Or did you get this email? Or kind of joke about it. When we're sitting at home, we're not going to do the same thing. We're probably not going to message somebody through Teams that I just got a phishing email. So it's how do we create that security culture? And it starts from management down, we talked about, but it's also everybody being okay with being the person that says, I just got phished, right? And alerting everybody else on our team, don't click on this email. It was good enough to get me. Don't click on it. But creating that culture where it's okay to bring things in and just keep it front of mind, because, you know, annual training is not going to do it. So we talked, you know, the users are the biggest problem. Phishing is the biggest vector. So how do we continue to create that security culture? And I think it takes creativity over time from the top down to every day asking yourself what you can do.
David, you're on the screen, so give us recommendations.
Yeah, one of the things I mentioned earlier, and it sounds kind of scary, especially for a smaller organization, but you can just, you know, look it up. It's not that scary. Again, there's that business impact analysis. So The two key acronyms are maximum tolerable downtime. So what is the amount of time that your business can go without running? And then RTO is your recovery time objective. So how long can we be down? How quickly can we come back up? And then associate that, as we were talking about, with business assets and certain data that you have. And you can even start there. So for instance, we had a company that at the end of the day, the only thing that mattered to them was their email. They do financial transactions. They simply need to know who wants to pull money out and who wants to put it in. As long as they have email, everything else can go down for a long time. So doing that analysis, I think, is really important. Stick with those basics like we talked about. Do the stuff that's free and cheap and easy. And I think if you stick with those pieces and just sort of look globally at everything that you need to do, you'll get off to a good start. But everybody can start and make progress regardless of where you're at or how small you are or how many compliances people want you to meet.
I guess I'll jump in. You guys obviously both touched on a lot of key points there, so I'm not going to repeat all this. But I guess coming from another area of something businesses can focus on, when it comes to, I don't think this is really thought about often, but as an IT provider or as a managed services provider, whatever the case is, another almost cheap and easy area to look at is when you're bringing on clients, when you're bringing on new clients that maybe had pre-existing providers or whatever the case might have been, or maybe no one at all. A lot of times there's this culture of, you don't want to break things, you don't want to mess up things, you don't want to make them unhappy. So you might come in with some suggestions, but a lot of times people leave things alone, or they don't do audits on what their previous security posture looked like. And, doing a risk assessment from them coming in, oh, well, we had a risk assessment, 2 years ago, and we got this, and they go, okay, and they just, move on. And I think, and what I see a lot on my end is it's, oh, I talk to people after incidents, and it's, oh yeah, we knew that had a weak password, but we just didn't want to have to change it through all their scanners. And there's that little bit of negligence, and I think it comes down to kind of what Scott said as well, being able to have those conversations with people, and even if it might be uncomfortable or they might be upset, or maybe, you think it's going to upset them, just coming down to actually being able to have those conversations, especially if you onboard somebody new or you have somebody new come in, and sitting them down immediately and just going, okay, here's where we're at. Let's look at each of these pieces and let's, bring you up to at least a baseline. Even if we can't get you where we want you, let's get MFA enabled. Let's get, each of those little parts that, like David mentioned, things that are maybe cost effective and really don't cost anything other than a little bit of time commitment. So
if they know their responsibility, right? Each employee should know their responsibility in regards to their defense against, cyber criminals. I think that's just is something really valuable. It's not about checking a box and we have to do this to check a box. It's, all right, you're in the finance department. If your credentials get leaked, this is what can happen. Then it puts us in a position where we could, damage our reputation. You don't want to be in that position. I don't want to be that employee that leaks credentials and puts a company under. So I want to know my responsibility to protect the organization. So you make a really great point there.
And to kind of add to that, it's something that I don't think we talked about much. Everything we're talking about is remote and phishing and more about that thing. But don't forget about physical security as well. Don't forget, especially in this remote workforce environment. If I'm the finance manager and now we're working from home all the time, and maybe I'm going to go sit at Starbucks every day and work on some of my stuff. Kind of back to that employee training and that conversation. There's a lot around physical security. Like a lot of these attack vectors, even if it's phishing, can start that way, can start in person, or things that people overhear, or conversations. I could sit out in a coffee shop all day and gather a ton of information on people just by hanging out there for about 6 or 7 hours. And then you could roll that into a phishing campaign against them or against their company. And that's how this all, people don't really think of it that way. And it doesn't always start that way, but you can't disclude that path as well. It's definitely important to kind of be aware, especially in this remote environment where we're all kind of letting our guard down a little bit, that at the when you're in the office, you're always like, oh, I'm going to walk away and lock my computer, and maybe you don't leave things on your desk. But now that we're away from that, it might be a lot easier to fall into that trap. So it's worth having those conversations too with people, even right now in this remote world, about what their posture and their environment looks like even when they're at home.
So you just stole kind of what I was going to say.
Sorry, Steven.
No, it's all fine. A lot of it does go back down to basics. Again, preaching security awareness, be aware of where you are. Like if you go up to get a refill on the coffee, don't leave your laptop at your table unlocked with, screen open. Throw it in your bag real quick, lock it, and bring it up with you. It just takes 2 seconds for someone to run up and steal the laptop. And going back to physical security, make sure every device that flies out the door has encryption on it. I know it sounds simple. Just make sure you turn it on. It's so easy. But I think another avenue, which I didn't really think a ton about when the pandemic first hit, because we were so focused at, moving people into remote workforce, working from home. You got to think about what's going to happen when people start coming back. So a lot of my friends are now actually returning to offices. So they're going back in rotations like every other day or something like that. And one thing that we found, because we just added a feature to our product that does passive and active scanning with our agents. And we're finding a lot of people bringing back some really weird stuff back into the home office, and not a lot of people, back into the corporate office. And not a lot of companies, I find, have a really good idea of what's actually on their network. Oftentimes. So like, for instance, I just recently did an engagement. We found 10 Chromecasts. Security team had no idea they were there. And that's because a lot of directors, they were like streaming football or streaming meetings to their TVs. So they're like, oh yeah, this is great. I can do this at home. Oh, well, now I got to go back to the office. Let me just unhook it from the TV, pop it on, our private Wi-Fi instead of shifting it over to the guest Wi-Fi. And boom, now you have an attack vector in a device that maybe you could listen to network traffic on the network. And that's something which, again, I didn't think about initially, but it became more and more apparent that not a lot of people have that visibility. So that's one basic, I guess, thing that I would preach is make sure you know what's in your network at all times, and make sure you can respond and get that device isolated or removed if you do find it. So
yeah, and not a lot of people have guest networks. I'll tell you that. They don't separate them.
Yeah. A super quick thing, because I know we're running up on time, but Christina, John, and Steve just mentioned things that all can be solved. Another thing that could be free, it's just a matter of a little bit of time, is please, think about reviewing your acceptable use policy and your employee handbooks. So how to work in a cafe, you can't bring a Chromecast into work, literally almost everything that we've just discussed. So now again that the boundaries have gone home, and I know Christine has talked about this a lot, the user has responsibility to know their data. Go back, look at your acceptable use policies, or look at a third party that can help you out. Look at your employee handbook, push that back out, do additional training, and all of these things. There's probably 80 tips from today that could all go into an acceptable use handbook. Pass it out to your team. It's not going to cost you anything except for time. Add that with some of the other pieces, and again, I think that goes a really, really, really long way.
Yep, and a good place to start. Absolutely, 100%. Yeah, so we're right up here on time. I just wanted to, have a special thank you for all of you guys on the panel today for your time and expertise. It's really important to come together and share our knowledge and help educate all the businesses out there and just protect them, keep the money working for their own business and out of the hackers' hands. Thank you for all the attendees that tuned in. Just a reminder that this recording, as well as the recommended resources that we didn't get a chance to dabble into, will be sent out with the slide deck. If you guys have any questions, you can, or feedback on the panel discussion, or want to request a dark web scan after today's call, just info@kellyconnect.com, and they will get back to you. Again, info@kellyconnect.com. Again, appreciate everybody's time. You've been amazing. and we'll see you all soon. Stay safe out there.
Thank you.
Everybody,
Bye.
thank you.